right, welcome to Warrior Theology Podcast, again with almost Dr. Van Cleek and Dr. Van Cleek, as you can see on the other screen. This podcast revolves around dealing with issues of biblical authority and what we would call biblical sexual worldview, or biblical sexual ethic. So those are the two things we do here. If you want to see our first podcast, really kind of like enumerates that, gives you a little bit more detail. But if you don't want to do that, you just want to hang on, and then hang on. So before we get started, I was just thinking about this. This is a big question for me. I don't have it all nailed down, but I do think it's something that needs to be considered. We exist in a world where the church is called to be salt and light, the believing community, right? We call it the institutional church. And the church is lamenting over the fact that something like 70% of millennials are leaving the church. Like, that's a big deal, right? And then the church is trying to sort out how to get millennials to stay, or the next generation to stay, so their churches aren't falling apart. And definitely those who are in the revitalization ministry know exactly what I'm talking about. And we even see that in our roles, particularly in mainline Protestant denominations and Baptists. I don't know. Just consider this. This is a bit of a rant before we actually get into our normal stuff. I guess I'm wondering, how is it that we as a believing community can send our kids to public school for 30 to 40 hours a week and put them in front of a screen for 30 hours a week, and then take them to church for 45 minutes, where most of the church for them, at least in youth group and younger, is about fidget spinners, entertainment, and how much fun you're having at church, but you still only spend about an hour, maybe 2 hours there a week. Then how is it that we can decry that people aren't staying in church? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. What makes sense to me is that we as a church are being self-destructive. That's what makes sense to me. It seems like that we are allowing our children to be raised by Romans, and then we're surprised that they want nothing to do with the Christian church. And so when we complain about things like gay marriage and abortion and pornography and our children wandering away from the Lord and away from the church and away from what they've been taught, the fact is that's what they've been taught. They've been taught by other thinkers. And then when they leave high school, like, they go to college and they learn it more. Like, it just piles up. Like, I don't know, it's not a theory right now because it's bearing itself out, but when you go to college and people are like, oh, they went to college, and then they, a secular professor in some anthropology class just totally told them that, ethics is contract theory, or, some kind of relativism, moral relativism. Now, your kids have been being taught this from the beginning, especially if they've been to public school. This is ingrained in them. And then if we as parents are working 2 jobs, mom's out of the house, dad's out of the house, we're not sitting around the table and having family devotions, we're not praying with them at the end of the night, we're not teaching them the Bible. The church gets them for an hour, maybe 40 minutes, and that's if they actually teach them the Bible, if they're not playing games with them, right? And then it's all this like therapeutic, moralistic deism. You're not actually teaching them about Jesus. You're just teaching them how to be pure teenagers, right? So not having sex with their girlfriend kind of stuff. I mean, which you can get from like Oprah if you want. And then your kids spend 30 hours, almost 40 hours, right? Full-time job, being raised by somebody else. And then you sweat that the church is falling apart and that no one cares about the truth. Like, no, we are doing the very thing that's ruining us. We decry the fact that our churches are getting smaller while we are engaging in the very thing that makes the church die. And then we're like, oh, we wish the church wasn't dying. And then we're killing it. And we're teaching our kids to teach their kids to keep killing the church. And by the church, I'm not saying like just show up to the building. I'm talking about teaching them, right? Raising them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, speaking with the word while you're in the way, when you rise up, when you go to bed, right? All of that. No, we're not doing any of that. We're leaving that up to somebody else. The reason why we're wrecked is because we're not actually raising our kids. That's why we're wrecked. And so you're like, well, what's the practical outworking? Well, the practical outworking is maybe you need to work a little less and maybe you should get them out of the public school, right? That costs money though. So I just said in the same breath, work less and then make less money and then incur a greater debt, right? Spend more money. But if you really care about the church, if you really care about your kids, then you need to get them out of the public school. You need to get them off the screen, and you need to start teaching them the Bible yourself. And that means you might have to be home on time for supper. So, I don't know. That's kind of what we're going to do here on this podcast. It's going to kind of be like this every once in a while. And that might get you mad, but come on, like, doesn't some of that make sense? It should make sense. You give 60 to 70 hours to some other worldview, and then you wonder why your kids don't hold your worldview because they went and colored a picture of Noah's Ark in Sunday school. Like, yeah, and then had a treat at the end of the day. Like, I wonder why my kids aren't following Jesus. I mean, I was just in a class, I taught a class, I asked my freshman students, how many of you can say the books of the Bible? None of them. I was like, how many of you call yourselves Christians? All of them. You can't do something as simple as name the books of the Bible, let alone the content of the Bible. And then we're sure that, oh yeah, church is doing great. This is the best way to do church. Look, we're killing it. It's shameful. And if the church is supposed to be salt and light, I don't know what salt and light looks like if that's what it's supposed to look like. So anyway, for today, we have, I don't know, Dad, you got something to fill in there? Sorry, I kind of like jumped it.
No, I just think that in a very hands-on way, every parent should just spend a few days at school.
Go to public school.
Yeah, just go and see it. Here in Northern Virginia, it would not take much time for you to spend time in a public school to say to yourself, this is not good for my kids.
Yeah, tell them, Dad. Tell them why you're bringing that particular aspect up.
I was in one middle school.
No, what do you do? What do you do when you're not preaching?
Well, I sub in the Prince William County school system up here, and so I mean it's been a really a good opportunity, but there was one phys ed class, and it was so out of control they didn't have phys ed. I was just in another middle school, and there's 3 fully armed police officers that are all through the building. They sweep the building. I actually stepped outside once, and there was like this little riot going on in a hallway. There was 4 kids choking 4 other kids, and the policeman was standing down at the end of the aisle, and I'm the one, as soon as I step out into the fray with middle school kids, I mean, I'm the one in trouble. I mean, if you touch any of them. So I just kind of use the size of my body to separate these kids. Anyway, it's very normative. If you're listening, you're saying, well, this sounds horrible. This is daily, ordinary. This is just the way it is. So if you tie what I just described into what Pete said, I mean, I'm not saying every school is like this, and not all the schools up here are like that.
Yeah, I know, but I wanted to talk about that because I knew that was going to come up, right? Because maybe the school you send your kids to isn't that bad, even though you send them 30 to 40 hours a week. And I just want to say this, right? Planned Parenthood tells us that 3.5% of their services are abortion. So the vast majority of what they say they do is good. And so they're like, stop breathing down our necks. We're not that bad. Fact is, they murder babies. I'm going to turn around and say it is not the government's job to raise your kids according to Christian worldview. So even if only 3.5% of the public schools are garbage, it still doesn't matter because they don't belong being raised by the government. They belong being raised by their Christian parents, being raised up in a Christian worldview. So when you can find a school where that's happening, that is a better place. Are those perfect either? No, that's not perfect. But in the end, just because your school you think might be okay, the fact is it's still not the government's job to be raising your kids. Sorry.
I would just I would just add to what Pete has said. The answer is family devotions. You've probably heard this your whole life. You probably heard it if you're in the church from your dad, from your grandfather. It is the it's the father's responsibility in the home to teach his family the Bible. That is one of his purposes in the home. He married, established himself. He's married to your mom, his wife. And now it's time to raise the children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, which means if those kids are going to learn anything, they're going to learn it from their dad and their mom. And if it's not happening there, you can rest assured that it's not happening in the church. The church, I've concluded, can be a place of encouragement and exhortation, as an evangelistic role as well. But as far as how much little kids and adolescents learn in church, how much theology they learn in church, in Sunday school we say here that if you call yourself a Christian, you ought to know all the books of the Bible. And all the little kids say that. It's funny. If you call yourself a Christian, do you know all the books of the Bible? I posted that on Facebook. Even people that love me and kind of got under their skin, because I said, don't just tell me that you know the books of the Bible. I want to hear them. And you're saying, well, you don't have to know the books of the Bible to go to heaven. And there's all these peripheral things, you can throw into that argument. That's not my point. My point is, how long you been going to church? And if you've been going to church your whole life, you're telling me that you don't know in the sacred text of the believing community of the church you attend, you've been attending your whole life, you still don't know 66 books of the Bible. You've been going there since birth. Now you're raising your own family. I mean, you're approaching the age of being a grandfather. You still don't know your books of the Bible. That is just that's a harbinger of the ignorance that is happening. People are not learning the Bible. So if the dad doesn't know the Bible, the kids aren't going to know the Bible. Somewhere in this vicious cycle, somebody has to break in and decide, for the sake of their home and for the homes around them, that they're going to have family devotions. And I just say my dad, and when you hear my testimony, my dad, Bill Van Cleek, who pastored up in Roscommon, saved out of a terrible situation, but he was committed. My dad, living on as a missionary, home missionary in Canada, we never had much. That's not a lament. We never had much, but what my dad did is teach us the Bible. I say it to everybody. I learned most of my Bible around the dinner table, and then college and grad school kind of put a point on it. But I learned my theology from my dad, and every son should, in some way or another, be able to say that. Because theology you learn from your dad is more settled, more sure, more certain than it will be from anybody else. So, and I know that's a mouthful, but it starts with dad. And listen, my dad didn't have a big library. He just studied the Bible. The reason he came to the conclusion he came to is because he read the Bible. Very simple. And then he passed that on to us. And then Pete's a grandson that started with my dad, and now Pete's raising his own family, generation after generation, as a result of my dad's faithfulness, have been impacted. And so that is where it settles. And there is no other way. You cannot count on your pastor to do it. In one of the church I pastored, after I was called, accepted the ministry, this guy came up to me, shaking my hand, so happy, because now the burden of his responsibility to raise his family was off his shoulders because they got a new pastor. And I looked right at him. And of course, this is not how to make friends and influence people, but I looked right at him. I said, it's not my responsibility as the pastor to raise your family. It's no pastor's responsibility to raise your family. It is the father's responsibility to raise your family. So nobody's perfect. We're all just dads doing our best.
That's right.
But the fact is, you just got to do it. You got to take the time to study it yourself and then pass that on to another generation. And I know this just falls on deaf ears. What Pete just said, it's like it just falls on deaf ears. But if there's going to be any change in America, it has to start in the home. And it's got to start there. So.
Yeah, and so like I'm just gonna cap with this, and we'll move on to our normal content. But if you're longing to see abortion, for instance, right? I think we're up to 70 million dead since 1973, murdered innocent babies in the land of the free and the home of the brave. It is not the government's job to establish morality. It should preserve morality. It is the church's job to establish morality in a community. But if the church will not raise up moral sons and daughters, then the church will not be moral. So even if you tried to pass a law from the federal level, it is not the government's job to institute morality. It doesn't make up morality. The church's job is to do that. So if you want to save your country, your church, your family, it boils down to how much Bible are they learning. And if you're only giving them 40 minutes to an hour every day on a Sunday morning, that's not what you're going to get. And so what we're looking at is catastrophe. So, but, I mean, it's going to be between you and God, gentlemen. And that's just the way it is, I guess.
So if you like this video, maybe you'd like some others. Take a look around.